The United States' highest military award for valor is the Medal of Honor, awarded by the President in the name of Congress. It is reserved for those members of the United States military who distinguish themselves through conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. Of course, for every Medal of Honor awarded, there is a story, but there is also the story of the Medal of Honor. And those two are intimately intertwined in the story of the nation's only chief executive to have been awarded the nation's highest and most prestigious military decoration. There is today a controversy regarding the portrayal of the events of July 1st, 1898. The battle and campaign had many connections to the Medal of Honor, notably the commanding general of the United States Army and overall command of the Army at the time of the war was Nelson Appleton Miles. Miles had been awarded the Medal of Honor for commanding the 61st New York Infantry at the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 2nd and 3rd, 1863. Miles would later play a significant role in the history of the Medal of Honor, chairing the Board of Generals who would review all of the medals awarded to that point and revoking more than a third of them. The Battle of July 1st was the effort by the 5th Army Corps to capture Spanish positions defending the city of Santiago de Cuba. The position on heights outside the city, variously referred to as San Juan Hill, the San Juan Heights, or San Juan Ridge, was critical to defending the city. Not only was it obvious that the heights would have to be taken, but there was an imperative to act quickly, as there were reports that significant Spanish reinforcements were being sent. The U.S. 5th Corps was under the command of Major General of Volunteers William Rufus Shafter. Shafter had been awarded the Medal of Honor for actions taken near Fair Oaks, Virginia on May 31st, 1862, while a first lieutenant with the 7th Michigan Infantry. Shafter ended the war as a brevet brigadier general of volunteers and saw significant further service on the frontier. At the outbreak of the war with Spain, he was commander of the Department of California. However, his appointment to a field command was something of a surprise. He was 63 years old and weighed over 300 pounds. David Trask, chief historian of the U.S. Army Center of Military History, explained in his 1996 work, The War with Spain, that Shafter was a chronic victim of gout, reacted adversely to the heat and overexertion experienced in Cuba. 5th Corps had landed in Cuba without significant opposition, except for the difficult surf. That landing had been under the direction of Brigadier General of Volunteers Henry Ware Lawton, commander of the 2nd Division. Lawton had been awarded the Medal of Honor for actions taken outside Atlanta on August 3, 1864, while a captain in the 30th Indiana Infantry. Military historian Mitch Yockelson, writing on the website of the National Archives, explained that upon landing in Cuba, the mission of the 5th Corps was unclear. The War Department gave Shafter instructions to destroy the Spanish forces at Santiago, but how to go about that was left up to him. To achieve this mission, Shafter had 3 divisions, 2 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, altogether numbering some 19,000 troops. One of the regiments of the cavalry division was the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. Yockelson explains that a severe shortage of men prevented the Army from immediately setting forth on an expedition to Cuba. To remedy the situation, President William McKinley proposed to Congress first a call for 125,000 state volunteers. While most of these troops would come from existing National Guard units, the legislation allowed the raising of 3 regiments of volunteer cavalry to serve independently from state units. Theodore Roosevelt was, at the outbreak of war, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a role in which he received much credit in preparing the Navy for war. While many supporters encouraged him to remain in that position, he wanted a field command. Writing in his 1913 autobiography, "I'd always felt that if there were a serious war, I wished to be in the position to explain to my children why I did take part in it, and not why I did not take part in it." Recognizing that Roosevelt would be effective at raising volunteers, Secretary of War Russell Alger offered command of the 1st Volunteer U.S. Cavalry to Roosevelt. But Roosevelt would explain in his autobiography that he felt his own military experience was insufficient to lead a regiment, and instead he suggested that he be made second in command, and command be given to his friend, Army Surgeon Leonard Wood. Wood had received the Medal of Honor for actions during the campaign against the Chiricahua Apache in 1886. While a surgeon and not a commissioned officer, he was cited for carrying dispatches through a region infested with hostiles and volunteering to command an infantry detachment that had lost all of its officers. Wood's award represented some of the controversy regarding the medal. Wood was politically connected. In fact, he had befriended Roosevelt while acting as the president's physician. The website of the U.S. Department of Defense notes the controversy within the Army. According to a biography of Wood written by John McCallum, some in the Army didn't think Wood was deserving of the honor because of his status as a medical officer. Many also didn't believe that chasing Geronimo across the desert counted as combat, which was a requirement for earning the medal. Furthermore, no other officers involved in the manhunt received similar honors. Despite undoubtedly brave service in the campaign and eventually distinguished service as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, the fact that Wood alone had received the medal for the Geronimo campaign raised a thorny question. Was the process of awarding the Medal of Honor overtly political? And that question would loom large for his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt. The climate of Cuba proved deadly. In fact, Americans fighting in Cuba were roughly 5 times as likely to contract yellow fever as they were to die in combat. By the end of June, Samuel B. Young, commander of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade, had fallen ill and was replaced by Wood. Despite his initial reticence, Theodore Roosevelt replaced Wood in command of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, which by then had already been given the name the Rough Riders by the press and were quickly renamed Roosevelt's Rough Riders by a friendly press, including Richard Harding Davis, who was reporting for the New York Herald, Times of London, and Scribner's Magazine. And Davis accompanied the Rough Riders in Cuba. A personal friend of Roosevelt, Yockelson writes, he acted as Roosevelt's own press secretary. The attack on the San Juan Heights was confused. Trask writes, at this juncture, then, the Army's inexperience with larger formations, brigades, and divisions came home to roost. The battles of July 1st lacked real coordination. For the most part, they fought themselves. There were limited avenues of attack, and the plan was fouled as Lawton's division got bogged down in an attack on a town near the heights, preventing their support of the attack. The troops of the Cavalry Division and the 1st Infantry Division were in an exposed position, pinned down by fire and without the support of Lawton's 2nd Infantry Division. Moreover, the use of a Signal Corps observation balloon, while providing vital intelligence on the defenses, had alerted the Spanish defenders, drawing a fusillade of fire. With little choice, the Cavalry and 1st Infantry Divisions advanced under the cover of U.S. artillery and Gatling guns. The Infantry Division attacked San Juan Hill, while 3 cavalry regiments were assigned to attack another defended hill, called Kettle Hill. Yockelson writes, what actually happened at this point is still quite confusing. A number of different versions of the battle by its participants conflict with each other. One issue is the contribution of Roosevelt and the Rough Riders versus the 10th Cavalry, a black regiment. There is no question that the press gave a great deal of credit for the capture of Kettle Hill to the Rough Riders at the time, although both units, as well as the 3rd U.S. Cavalry, attacked the hill at the same time. Some renditions of the battle have Roosevelt arriving among the first at the top of the hill, while others argue that the battle had nearly finished before Roosevelt got to the top. Many accounts, including that of future General John Pershing, a first lieutenant of the 10th Cavalry, recall that the units had become intermingled. Roosevelt himself initially wrote that no one can tell whether it was the Rough Riders or the men of the 9th who came forward with the greater courage to offer their lives in the service of their country, although he would later revise that position. While there is a fair discussion of whether the reporting was biased, for example, this famous photo showing the 3rd U.S., 1st U.S. Volunteer, and 10th Cavalry has often been cropped to only include the Rough Riders in the center, it is clear that the Rough Riders were in the thick of the fight, and that Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt exposed himself to fire by riding up the hill on his horse, Texas, while the rest of the attack was made on foot. The U.S. Department of Defense writes, he rode up and down the hill on horseback, leaving no doubt that he was one of the enemy's most important targets, yet he wasn't hit by any bullets. Instead, Roosevelt was the first to reach enemy trenches, where he quickly killed an enemy with his pistol. The assault helped turn the tide of the war in America's favor. And there became another controversy. Yockelson writes, before Roosevelt and his Rough Riders left Cuba for the United States, he commenced fighting another personal battle. General Wheeler promised to recommend him to the War Department for a Medal of Honor, and his good friend Leonard Wood got the ball rolling by submitting the first endorsement on July 6th. The plea was complicated by a scandal. As previously mentioned, disease was more deadly to the troops in Cuba than the enemy. The taking of the heights and repelling of the counterattacks had essentially sealed the fate of the Spanish in Cuba, who surrendered after a 2-week siege of Santiago and forfeited the island. But thousands of U.S. troops lay incapacitated with tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. The McKinley administration dragged its feet, unsure whether to return these troops to the U.S. or quarantine them in Cuba until the epidemic passed. Senior officials of the Fifth Corps, including Roosevelt, circulated a letter stating the opinion that the troops should be returned to the U.S. for care, or that many would die. The letter came to be called the round-robin letter, as Yelkelson writes, because the dispatches went through so many hands. The administration was embarrassed when the letter reached the press, forcing them to act. Roosevelt, who had a known cozy relationship with the press, was widely suspected of being the one who leaked the letter, although there was no proof, and even some speculation that the Secretary of War had leaked the letter to harm Roosevelt's political aspirations. But the letter and fallout with the administration resulted in another question. Some have suggested, and Roosevelt clearly suspected, that the embarrassment to the War Department over the round-robin affair had turned them against Roosevelt's nomination for the Medal of Honor. There are reasons to question the claim. Roosevelt's nomination was supported by his superiors, Wood, Wheeler, and Shafter, but none had been there to witness Roosevelt's acts that day. Roosevelt solicited letters from others who had been there that day, but their many accounts were often contradictory. Roosevelt took a personal interest, writing to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, "I am entitled to the Medal of Honor, and I want it." He repeatedly pressed political allies in the War Office, became convinced that Secretary Alger had said in public that he did not deserve it, something which he insisted was intended to bias the Army Committee making decisions. He wavered back and forth between pressing the claim and seeming to accept that he wouldn't get the award. Writing to another officer, "I do not believe the War Department has the slightest intention of granting it, and I have really given up thinking about it. You see, I cannot blame the War Department for feeling bitterly towards me now, for I have hit and intend to hit them hard for what they have done and left undone. And I am rather pleased that otherwise they should have given me no excuse to feel under any obligation to them." When the committee, called the Brevet Committee, finally released its report, Yelkelson writes, 28 participants of the Santiago campaign were approved to receive the Medal of Honor for gallantry in action, but Roosevelt's name was not among them. Yelkelson discounts claims that the decision was political, writing, "Certainly no evidence exists to support the contention that Alger held a grudge over the round-robin affair or Roosevelt's testimony to the Congressional Committee. On the contrary, letters from the War Department to Roosevelt indicate that they were more than willing to assist him in getting the Medal of Honor. One can only assume that the Brevet Board came to the conclusion that though Roosevelt's conduct in Cuba was quite admirable, it was not worthy of a Medal of Honor." Moreover, Yelkelson writes, Roosevelt's interest might have been largely political, as the medal would have been useful for a man with political ambitions, and as his career rose quickly, propelling him to the office of Governor of New York, Vice President, and upon the assassination of William McKinley, the presidency, the award was clearly unnecessary. But the decision didn't sit well with some. In 1998, Tweed Roosevelt, Roosevelt's great-grandson, pushed Congress for legislation to award the medal. Congress passed the legislation, arguing that Theodore Roosevelt's actions were consistent with the actions of those who were awarded the Medal of Honor that day and throughout the Spanish-American War. Notably, many of those who did receive the award were noted for exposing themselves to enemy fire for various reasons. Committee Chairman, Indiana Senator Steve Breyer, argued if voluntary exposure to enemy fire was the criterion for award of the medal, then Theodore Roosevelt clearly exceeded the standard. Congress approved the recommendation, but President Clinton wanted to first ask the opinion of the Army. Finally, on January 16, 2001, Clinton presented the medal to Tweed Roosevelt. 31 of 46 U.S. presidents have served in the U.S. military. Theodore Roosevelt is the only one who has received the Medal of Honor. It is a unique honor. As another veteran who served as chief executive, Harry Truman, famously said at a medal award ceremony, "I'd rather have this medal than be president." In another twist, on September 21, 1944, Theodore Roosevelt's son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general officer to land on the beach on D-Day, was awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously as he had died of a heart attack the previous July. Theodore and Theodore Jr. are one of only two father and son pairs to have received the medal, along with Arthur MacArthur and his son, Douglas MacArthur. But the story raises another question. Was the final award to Theodore Roosevelt also an act of politics? I mean, after all, there were other officers that hot July 1st who distinguished themselves, who exposed themselves to fire, some of whom didn't come home, yet didn't receive the Medal of Honor. As Yelkelson writes, to single out Theodore Roosevelt among those other line officers would have been a great injustice, and the merit of the award would have been cheapened. Ironically, Roosevelt might have agreed himself. In 1907, he was offered the opportunity to join a Medal of Honor society, and he responded, declining, saying, "I feel that the board that declined to award it took exactly the right position. Perhaps the man who had received so many accolades, including, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize, already had enough medals. So should he have been awarded the Medal of Honor in 1898? Should he have been awarded the medal in 2001? I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.